Hey, Slider Crusaders, I want to talk about people who impose their opinions on historical figures and why they do this. Let's back it up. I read this blog. It's called Joyous and Swift. And he included this sentence, and I love this. I've been thinking a lot about this these last couple weeks. He said, most people's observations say more about the person doing the observing than what's being observed. Let me change one word there. Just, it can go both ways. It could be positive or negative, but let me take the negative connotation there because I think it's easier to understand. Change it to word criticize. So I think, so it would be most people's criticisms say more about the person doing the criticizing than what's being criticized, right? Does that make sense? And I think that's true, and I think you've experienced that. I think we brought this up with the Michael Wolff Fire and Fury anti-Trump book, right? So if you insert his name in there, Michael Wolff's criticism of the Trump presidency in his book says more about Michael Wolff than it does Donald Trump. I think that's fair. But let's go back to the original sentence about observing. The cover of the New Yorker is a cartoon image of Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett. They're both kneeling. Two NFL players, both kneeling, with Martin Luther King Jr. in the middle, kneeling with them. And the artist wrote, what would King be doing if he were around today? I'm sure that if King were around today, he'd be disappointed at the slow pace of progress, 2 steps forward, 20 steps back. This is something I'm going to be more careful with moving forward. There's a big difference between learning from history, right? Learning from our past, learning from the greats, taking the lessons from Martin Luther King Jr.'s wisdom, which is biblical wisdom, taking that and applying it to today. That's great, right? But to take the historical figure and superimpose your own opinions onto him as if you're sure he would agree with you, that seems inappropriate. And I've made this mistake before. Right? I've said stuff on the radio like, oh yeah, Thomas Jefferson would think this is a terrible bill. That's really a lazy way of saying Thomas Jefferson wrote a lot about limited government. This bill grows government. Therefore, I'm against it, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote about limited government, warning us against, or vote in favor. Thomas Jefferson wrote in favor of limited government. I agree with him for these reasons. This bill grows government. Therefore, I'm against the bill, right? That's a logical argument. It's much more lazy and manipulative. It's actually an emotional ploy to do the first one, where you superimpose your opinion on a historical figure. So one way to make an argument is called appeal to authority. Instead of making an argument based on the merits, you bring in an authority, as if that is sufficient to give your argument weight to make it true. Now, there's a time or a place for this, but it is not a complete argument in and of itself. You can't just say, well, Donald Trump says, or this professor says, or 98% of scientists agree. You can't just do that. It can bolster an argument, but it isn't truth just because someone from authority said it. So worse than that is when you take someone who's dead and who can't fully speak to an issue and you put your opinion in that person's mouth, right? So you say, oh, kneeling during the national anthem is great. And to convince other people to join your opinion, you say, oh, Martin Luther King Jr. would have supported kneeling during national anthem protest. You don't know that. And it's manipulative. Because if I then say, you don't know that, then now I'm against Martin Luther King Jr. and the whole civil rights movement, and I'm a racist. And you've just added this whole new emotional level to this conversation. So it's just a warning as we're out there. Be careful of making this argument, and when you hear the argument of, this dead person would, it's especially dangerous because kids today don't know history, and people can create mythical characters. For instance, he's not the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. anymore. He's whatever you want him to be. Right? Or whatever I want him to be, as long as he agrees with me. And if people don't know history, if people don't know Martin Luther King Jr., and what he really stood for and what he really said, then people just go with it. Like, yeah, okay. So before long, every historical figure will be framed as some social justice warrior or some kind progressive feminist or a Nazi, whatever suits the purposes of the person making the argument. I'll just end here with one example of how not knowing history leads people to be easily manipulated. What's the greatest love story of all time? If this was the Family Feud, the number one answer would be Romeo and Juliet. Now, the reason that's the number one love story of all time is because almost no one has ever read it. Well, no one recently, in the last couple decades, has read it. We have an idea of what Romeo and Juliet is about, kind of like we just have like an idea of what Martin Luther King Jr. was about, most people. With Romeo and Juliet, you're like, yeah, like two young people that love each other or something, right? That's most people's knowledge of Romeo and Juliet. Our culture and Hallmark has turned Romeo and Juliet into an example of true love. And no one questions it because very few people have read it. So give it another go if you'd like, and maybe it's been decades since you've read it, if ever. It's actually a terrible tragedy about a dirtbag guy who really wants to have sex with this one girl, but he gets shot down, so he sneaks into a different party, finds another girl who's 13, the same age as Shakespeare's daughter when he wrote this, hence this being a warning to her. He can't marry her because she's from the enemy family, but fueled by lust, within just a few hours, he kills her cousin, marries her in secret. He then splits out of town without her. To get him back, she fakes her own death. He comes back, thinks she's dead, kills himself. She wakes up, sees he's dead, and then kills herself for real. The entire play takes place over like 3 days, and they got married in like 8 hours after knowing each other. This is not a love story. This is a warning about the danger of infatuation and lust. And really, Romeo just wanted to have sex because the first girl he wanted to have sex with, promised not to have sex until marriage, and wouldn't even accept money to break that pledge. What a dirtbag. So I share this not to ruin any upcoming Valentine's days, but just as an example of how, if you don't know history, how easily people and past events can be manipulated into whatever someone wants them to be. All right? If you knew Romeo and Juliet and someone said, "Oh, Romeo and Juliet, what a great love story," you'd be like, "No." If you knew Martin Luther King Jr., they say, "Oh yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. would definitely support NFL protests." You're like, "Really? I don't know if that's definitely true." Learn and teach your kids as much history as possible so that they cannot be easily manipulated.